Both leaders agreed to 2 interviews with 7:30 during the election campaign. The opposition leader, Bill Shorten, is with me for his second tonight. Thank you very much for coming in.
Good evening,
You
Lee.
parked the Bill bus out the front driveway, I noticed.
A little ostentatious, but anyway.
The Prime Minister's second interview landed on a Brexit day, so about half the interview was on foreign policy. So in the interest of fairness, I thought we would do the same tonight. Since the Brexit, Mr Turnbull has campaigned on the message of stability, saying that given the global uncertainty, it's not the right time to change government. What do you say to Australians who might be casting their vote thinking, yes, that makes sense?
Mr Turnbull's misunderstood the lessons of the Brexit decision. What happened there is you had a weak Conservative leader making a deal with the right wing of his party to have a referendum which he didn't believe in himself. That's one lesson. You can't get stability if you've got a weak leader and a divided party. But I think the even deeper lesson arising out of Brexit is that there's a whole lot of people in Britain who feel alienated by globalisation, who feel disenchanted with the political process. And of course, now is not the time to have policies which may increase the distance between the haves and the have-nots, which may undermine the social fabric of a society and will indeed lead to greater disenchantment.
What about the central point of my question, though, that Mr Turnbull is saying it's not the time to change course when there's a lot of instability around the world?
Well, the point is, Mr Turnbull's policies, if he gets re-elected, will contribute to greater instability in Australia. If you have to pay more to see the doctor, if our schools are not properly funded, if the only economic policy that a government has is to give massive tax cuts to the top end of town or high net worth individuals, that's going to create a greater sense of disillusionment. His policies don't unite the country. You can't unite it when you're cutting school funding or not funding hospitals properly or existing in a society where the industrial safety net and penalty rates are getting undermined and we've got real wages growth flatlining.
The US President Barack Obama warned today that the Brexit has potential negative consequences for global economic growth. Doesn't that undermine your position that it's the right time to have higher spending and larger deficits?
No. The fact of the matter is that if Mr Turnbull thinks...
No, I'm asking about your policies.
Oh, well, this election's about his policies and mine. If Mr Turnbull thinks that this is the right time when you've got economic instability elsewhere, if he truly thinks that, then why is he persisting with taking $50 billion out of the budget?
But you might be... Sorry, were you going to talk about your own policies?
Yeah, by contrast. So I'm saying his policies are completely the wrong way to go in the light of if there's to be overseas instability, and he should take his policies off the table. What we need to generate greater growth is you invest in jobs, you invest in infrastructure, you invest in skills and education and a strong healthcare system. Our policies actually strengthen growth.
But if global growth is weak, then the figures that you're assuming for growth that allow you to meet some of your spending targets and your return to surplus targets may not be there. You'll also have lower revenue. So therefore, doesn't it make it risky for Australians to embrace a higher spending, higher deficit platform?
Well, first of all, Mr Turnbull uses the same assumptions that we use. And secondly, the difference between his position in the next 4 years and mine is the difference is investment in education, it's investment in infrastructure, it's investment in healthcare.
Still higher short-term spending, higher short-term deficits.
But our argument's pretty straightforward to the Australian people. We say that if you wind back investment in education, you wind back investment in Medicare, you wind back investment in infrastructure, you will compromise the long-term foundations of stable growth in this country. If Mr Turnbull really thinks that there's all these problems overseas which are going to affect Australia, why on earth is he still persisting with giving away $50 billion to large companies?
Along with the Brexit, the other potentially destabilising world event is the possible election of Donald Trump to be the United States president. You've previously said that some of Mr Trump's views are barking mad. If you were the Prime Minister, presumably you could not, in good conscience, send Australian troops into US-led military actions if you believed that the Commander-in-Chief were barking mad.
Well, first of all, the American alliance with Australia is a cornerstone of Labor foreign policy and it's a cornerstone of Australian policy. Let's be really clear here. There is no difference between Liberal and Labor when it comes to the importance of the US alliance to Australian foreign policy. In terms of a military scenario in the future, I'm not going to make strategic military decisions on the 7:30 report, Lee.
How could you, though, keep the US alliance as the cornerstone of our foreign policy if the Commander-in-Chief were, in your words, barking mad?
Well, he's got some views which and to be honest, I think most Australians don't agree with. But it's up to the American people who they select.
But I'm asking, if you're Prime Minister, he's the President, I mean, it's a very big part of our foreign policy. Surely you'd have to rethink
I'm
it.
not going to start catastrophising about the US alliance, Lee. And in terms of military engagements in the future, the sort of Prime Minister I'll be is I'm not going to sort of give a spur-of-the-moment answer on a show, even as one as respectable as this.
We saw a terrorist attack in Turkey this week, similar to the one in Brussels earlier this year, believed to be carried out by Islamist terrorists. What is Labor's strategy for winning the war against Islamic State?
Well, again, there's been complete bipartisanship. And it was one thing which Tony Abbott even was generous enough to acknowledge when he was the Liberal Prime Minister. When it comes to opposing ISIS, Liberal and Labor are on the same page. I've had the privilege of visiting Baghdad and talking to some of our remarkably skilled ADF personnel when they were working there, helping train up the Iraqi government.
And so is your strategy like a deployment without end, or what's your actual strategy?
No. The strategy which we're relying upon is making sure that the contribution we make is enhancing the national borders of Iraq. We're most committed to training up, but not going beyond the wire, of Iraqi troops, so they've got their own capacity to be able to regain control of their country. We're very committed, of course, to making sure that the Iraqi government adheres to the rules of law and make sure that they treat their minorities appropriately in turn.
On defence policy, why do you support paying a premium to have submarines built here in Australia when they could be built elsewhere more cheaply, and those extra billions could be put towards schools and hospitals and the other sorts of things that you say are important investments for economic growth?
Well, I don't believe that the premium for building it somewhere else, the costs are that much cheaper than building it here. Labor's led the debate on submarine manufacturing and the future frigate manufacturing in Australia. Back 2 years ago when I was opposition leader, we made the Liberal government honour their promise to build these submarines in South Australia. The advantages of building the subs here is, one, we've got a high quality workforce. Two, it's a good spur for defence manufacturing to help small business. Three, it's a good source of training apprentices.
But if you put aside the domestic economic argument, though, what is the strategic reason for Australians to build submarines here when the best expertise in the world at that is in Germany and France and Japan?
Well, I actually think Australia can be a world leader in terms of expertise of building our submarines. I believe that defence manufacturing and indeed our defence capacity is enhanced when we have the skill sets in Australia to build these submarines. During the Falklands War conflict, when Australia was getting materials from the UK, because of the Falklands War, we weren't able to get replacement parts for Australian defence machinery because the English were in their own conflict and they diverted resources there. Now, I want Australia to have its own independent capacity to make things which enhance our national security. And of course, if we spend valuable Commonwealth taxpayer dollars, I will quite reasonably, I think, stand up for local content because I want to see Australian blue-collar jobs, advanced manufacturing in Australia. That's one thing which South Australians and I share a very common view. We can do good work in South Australia and elsewhere in our dockyards.
All right, let's move off foreign policy and defence and into the campaign. This week you claimed a remark by Malcolm Turnbull that what political parties say isn't always what they do, and you said it was the defining moment of the campaign. You were exposed for taking it out of context because he was talking about Labor, not about himself. Was it in fact the defining moment of your campaign, illustrating your tendency to overreach?
Well, no, that isn't what he said. After Malcolm Turnbull was bagging Labor, nothing unusual about that. But he said political parties don't necessarily do after an election, words to that effect. He said political parties.
In the context of a whole discussion about Labor.
Yes, but when you use the plural, political parties, he's not talking about two Labor parties, he's talking about his own. Like, the truth of the matter is, this fellow is so confident that he's won the election that he's already giving himself a leave pass to break his promises. He said political parties, plural.
The Turnbull remark wasn't an isolated example of overreach, though. You've continued to run the 15% GST scare campaign. You've claimed the government would privatise Medicare when there's no such policy. You yourself have said that genuine Australians can spot a fake from a mile away. Have you hurt your credibility by stretching the truth and switching course on policy a little bit too often?
Well, not at all. First of all, I don't accept that what Mr Turnbull said is just he was just talking about the Labor Party. This fellow blames everyone else when he says the wrong thing. He said political parties, and let's go through...
Even though it was in the context of I want to move on, but even though it was in the context of a whole remark about Labor.
Oh, well, it wasn't. He said political parties.
Okay.
But in terms of the 15%,
Yep.
in terms of 15%, the Liberals flirted for 6 months with increasing the GST. I sat there in Parliament when Mr Turnbull would give these long explanations about how you could see the merits of a GST.
Is there a policy in this election to raise the GST to 15%?
The Liberals are making it very clear that their economic policy in this election is not a 15% GST, but an economic plan to give $50 billion away to large companies.
So why are you running a scare campaign on the 15% GST then?
Because I know that it's in the DNA of the Liberals, if they have power, to go back to the 15% GST argument. Does anyone in Australia seriously think that if Mr Turnbull didn't have control, if he had control of the Senate and the House of Representatives, he wouldn't look at a broad-based consumption tax? Of course he would. And in terms of our privatisation, the Liberals set up a $5 million task force to look at outsourcing the payment system of Medicare.
Labor's never looked at outsourcing the payment system for any sort of government entity?
We're answering your earlier question where you said, oh, isn't this overreach? They spent 6 months looking at a GST and they've only dropped it because of the pressure Labor put on, and they had a privatisation task force which was revealed in estimates.
I don't want to go over the same ground we went over last time, but again, does the Coalition have a Medicare privatisation policy this election?
I have no doubt that if the Coalition had their way, they would systematically undermine Medicare brick by brick, piece by piece.
Let's run through a few other quick examples.
I think healthcare is the key issue.
We did go through Medicare a lot last time we spoke.
It was only just because you were challenging what I was saying, and I just wanted to say...
Wrap it up. Yep.
Sure.
Please.
First of all, they are freezing the GP rebate for 6 years. That's going to affect bulk billing. The Royal College of GPs say that. They're increasing the price of medicine, and they're also, as of tomorrow, getting rid of bulk billing incentives for blood tests and x-rays. The Liberals cannot be trusted with Medicare. I mean, this election boils down to this choice. You can have Malcolm Turnbull or you can have Medicare. You just can't have both.
I again raise that, isn't that an overreach? Are you really saying to Australians, do you really think Australians believe that come Saturday they can have Malcolm Turnbull or they can have Medicare?
A vote for Malcolm Turnbull will see billions of dollars of reduction in the Medicare.
You just said Malcolm Turnbull or Medicare.
That's right.
Is that what you really believe?
I really believe that if Malcolm Turnbull gets elected, Medicare as we know it will be smashed in terms of funding, bulk billing will be greatly under pressure. It was revealed this week by the Royal Australian College of GPs that in fact, even though Mr Turnbull says 86% of doctors bulk bill, the fact of the matter is only 43% of doctors now provide bulk billing for between 80 and 100% of their customers. And I am gravely concerned for the future of Medicare.
Let's run through a few other quick things before we run out of time. Superannuation. You heavily criticise the government's policy, then you count the income from it in your own pool to finance your own spending, and then you say, oh, well, actually, we're going to review super plans once we get into government. How can Australians trust a leader who traffics in such inconsistency?
Well, first of all, the Liberal Party did make a hash of their superannuation change.
We're talking about your policy. You might be the Prime Minister on Monday.
But you were putting my comments to me, and what I was doing was giving them context. The Liberals in their budget did make a dreadful hash of superannuation. The poor old tax office and accountants have been swamped ever since these changes. Secondly, one of our grave concerns, and I still hold these concerns, is that Mr Turnbull's changes are retrospective, changing the goalposts. Now, Mr Turnbull
you say that you're concerned about it, and yet you're banking the money.
Well, Mr Turnbull has assured Australians, he's looked down the barrel of the camera in one of those few fleeting moments.
We're talking about your policies.
I am too. So, in one of those few fleeting moments that Mr Turnbull would care to debate
So why are we talking about Mr Turnbull again?
Because you've asked me to say, why is it about our superannuation policies and what's happening? And you've asked me to respond to my comments I've made about Mr Turnbull's. They've made a hash of it. He says it's not retrospective. What we will do is, when we get into government, if we get into government, we'll get independent experts to establish whether or not it's retrospective, and also, very crucially...
But if you're going to do that, how can you really be banking the money?
Also, very crucially, whether or not it can be implemented. And how can we do this? Because if Mr Turnbull's changes are actually found to be retrospective, surely he wouldn't be banking the money, would he?
OK, I'm getting the wrap-up, so let me just quickly ask you a couple of things. You know Labor politics well. Presumably it wouldn't be beyond your imagination to think that some of your colleagues might already be jockeying for position in case you lose on Saturday.
Oh, I don't think that's very fair. I think Labor in the last 3 years has at least deserves some respect for the degree of unity. We've shown more unity in the last 3 years than we've shown in the previous 15 or 20 years.
I'm not saying you haven't, but it is
so
politics.
I'm going to stick up for my colleagues here. I think if you want to look at leadership tension, you just look no further than the Liberal Party. 9 months ago, if you'd been interviewing the Liberal Prime Minister, it would have been Tony Abbott.
Opposition leader is a job from which every occupant hopes to graduate.
That is true.
Would you stick with it for another 3 years if it comes to that?
Lee, I haven't given up winning this election, and there's good reasons why I haven't given up winning it. We're ready to govern. We've got policies that we're ready to implement, we're ready to serve. And I'm going to make one final promise on this election promise and do it on your show. If people vote for Labor, we won't let them down.
I'm smiling because I knew you'd talk about election day, but I just want to ask, would you stick as opposition leader if it comes to that?
Lee, have you asked Malcolm Turnbull if he'd stick around if he loses the election?
Well, I will if he comes on tomorrow night.
Well,
will you stick around?
I'll give the same answer Malcolm did. We're in it to win it.
Bill Shorten, you promised to come on the program twice. You've honoured your word. Thank you very much for explaining your positions to our viewers during the campaign.
Thanks very much, Lee.